My dear, there are things one only understands with time, when life has already rolled over you and through you, and somehow you're still standing, even if patched up inside. And only after many silences did I find the courage to tell this story, because it isn't easy to admit you were deceived, and worse still, that the person who deceived you was someone you called your heart's daughter. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. For many, many years, I believed I was surrounded by affection. My husband, Antonio, was a man of few words, but always a worker. His hands were always busy, with tools, fixing the fence, repairing something in the shed, washing the car on Sundays. He wasn't the tender type, not one for waist-holding or birthday surprises, but he was there, present, in his own way. I was a homemaker, dedicated, one of those who knew the exact timing of the beans, who boiled sheets in hot water and hung them in the sun. I loved the rhythm, the plants on the porch, the sound of the children's laughter filling the house. It was a simple life, but it was mine. No luxury, no travels, no long rests, but full of meaning. It was during one of those busy chapters of life, with 2 little children and Antonio working from sunup to sundown, that she came. Her name was Conceição, recommended by a neighbor from down the street. They said she was a good girl, trustworthy, and needed a place to live and work. She arrived in a pale dress, with calm eyes and a small bag. She hardly spoke, but she smiled often. And I, always one to welcome, opened both my door and my heart. I gave her a room out back, some hand-me-down clothes from the children, and always a plate at the table. In time, she became part of the house, helped with the children, with the food, the cleaning. She was careful, respectful, and seemed to genuinely care for me. When I fell ill with back trouble and couldn't bend for weeks, it was she who washed my hair, scrubbed my back, and read me verses from the Bible. Around then, I began calling her daughter, not out of duty, but out of affection, because I truly believed she was. And Antonio? Well, he never paid her much mind. At least, that's what I thought at first. Later, well, that's a story for another time. All I can say now is that back then, nothing seemed wrong. The house was clean, the children were fed, I had someone to help and talk to, and he was always tired, yes, but he still slept beside me. That's how it went for many years. People would tell me how lucky I was to have someone like her around. I even said it myself. I never had to ask her twice for anything. She never raised her voice, never disrespected me. At year's end, she'd help make the French toast, roll the candies, tend to the children as if they were her own flesh. And me, I trusted her, with closed eyes, with an open soul. I trusted her the way one prays, never imagining there could be sin hiding in it. Trust, my dear, is a kind of faith. You don't see it, but you believe. And that's why it hurts so much. But that I only discovered much later. And when I did, my dear, not even the pain of childbirth could compare. Because this was a pain that gave birth to silence, that birthed shame, that birthed me again, old but awake. Today I tell you because time has given me courage, not for revenge, but as a warning, because sometimes the worst poison lives inside the softest embrace. It was one of those mornings when your body wakes up already tired, that Conceição knocked on my door for the first time. I wasn't expecting her, but God sometimes wraps life in the shape of people. And at that moment, I thought she was a blessing. Today, I know that not everything that shines comes from heaven. She was recommended by Dona Geralda, my neighbor in the blue house just past the corner. A woman of her word, the kind who brings soup when you're ill and lends sugar without asking for it back. She knew I was overwhelmed. 2 small children, my husband gone all day, and my back beginning to give out. She said to me, "Maria, there's a good girl. Comes from simple folk, but she's decent. Needs a place to stay and work. If you'd like, I'll bring her to you." The next morning, bright and early, there came Dona Geralda with her, Conceição. She carried a worn little suitcase and kept her eyes low. She was thin, terribly so, and had her hair tied in a plain bun. She wore a faded floral dress and held a rosary in both hands like one clinging to hope. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about her moved me, a quiet sadness, a way of crying out without sound. I've always had a soft heart, and so I let her in. I sat her down at the table, served her coffee and leftover bread, and asked where she was from. She said she came from the countryside, a small town I'd barely heard of. Her parents had died, her mother first from fever, and her father soon after of sorrow. She was alone in the world. She had worked in 2 houses but had been dismissed without explanation. She wanted a new beginning. "I just want a corner and something to do with my hands," she said. I don't know if it was pity or instinct, but right then and there, I decided she would stay. I showed her the small room out back, where Aunt Amelia used to sleep when she visited. It wasn't grand or pretty, but it had a bed, a window, and an old dresser. She smiled with her eyes. Her lips barely moved. "It's more than I hoped for, ma'am." That night, after the boys had gone to sleep and Antonio had turned in early, I sat in the kitchen, an empty cup in my hands, thinking. I can't quite explain, but something about her unsettled me. It wasn't fear nor dislike. It was a feeling with no name. But like so many times in life, I ignored the nudge. In the first days, she hardly spoke. She did everything I asked, calmly, precisely. She washed clothes spotless, swept the house with light steps, chopped vegetables with skill that impressed me. She never asked, never complained. It was as if she had been born to serve. The boys took to her quickly. She told animal stories, sang old lullabies while ironing, and put them to sleep with her hand gently resting on their chests. Even I, worn and weary, felt a kind of relief. For the first time in a long time, I slept until the sun came up. Conceição began to take over more and more of the house. Slowly she began doing things before I even asked. I would thank her, and she'd reply, "Think nothing of it," without ever meeting my gaze. And Antonio? He noticed. At first, only because of the tidy house. Later, because the food had improved. She cooked as if she were praying. Said she learned from her grandmother on a wood stove. And since men praise what fills their bellies, he started saying, "The house feels peaceful." I smiled, thinking I had earned that peace. I remember one day coming home from the market, arms full of bags, sweat running down my back. As I walked in, I saw them laughing in the kitchen. He was sitting, she was standing, stirring a pot. When they saw me, she went quiet, and he cleared his throat. I thought it natural. Who was I to be suspicious of such a moment? But something inside me quivered then, like a curtain shifting when there's no wind. Still, I carried on. I let it pass. Because those who tend too much to the house often miss the details, and I thought I was doing everything right. Time went by, and she stayed. Months became years. Conceição became part of the home. No one questioned her presence. It was as if she had always been there, and I, blinded by routine, kept my heart too open. If I could go back, maybe I would have looked more closely, paid more attention to the silence. But back then, what I needed most was help, and she seemed heaven-sent. Little did I know, she carried the mark of the devil. As the days passed, Conceição's presence in my home became like part of the air. Her footsteps weren't heard. She never complained. She was like a gentle shadow, the kind that protects and cools. She woke before everyone, lit the stove, warmed the milk, and set the table with a care that reminded me of my grandmother. I, who had always done everything on my own, began to allow myself a little rest. At first, it felt strange to wake up and find the kitchen in order, the children already dressed, the laundry on the line. It felt like magic, but it was only her, working quietly, with a dedication that disarmed me. She had a delicate, almost timid way of tending to things. She folded the towels with precision, ironed Antonio's shirts without a single crooked crease, perfumed the sheets with eucalyptus leaves. I never had to ask her twice for anything. It was as if she knew what needed doing before I did. In time, we began talking more. While I peeled potatoes and she chopped onions, we would share stories from our childhoods. She didn't say much, but she listened deeply, with her eyes, and when she did speak, it was always in a gentle tone, like someone afraid to interrupt the world. The boys grew so fond of her they sometimes called her Auntie Conceição. She took them under the mango tree, made dolls out of corn husks, sang lullabies I had nearly forgotten. She bathed them with care, combed their hair gently, and braided the little girl's dolls as if she were stitching lace. And Antonio? Well, he seemed lighter. He began coming home in better spirits, said things were finally running smoothly, that I could finally rest. I smiled, feeling both grateful and a little guilty. Grateful for the help, guilty for no longer being the only one tending to everything. I began to trust Conceição, like one trusts a sister. I let her go to the market in my place, deliver messages at the shop, pick up the children from school. She never gave me reason to doubt. She kept her word, never arrived late, never missed a task. On Sundays, we'd sit together on the porch bench, barefoot, tea towels on our laps. She would mend clothes while I embroidered, and we'd talk about life. Sometimes she'd tell stories of her time with her grandparents. Other times, she'd simply listen to the wind. I remember one day I felt terribly ill. High fever, aching all over. Antonio rushed out to find a doctor, and it was she, only she, who stayed with me. She changed the towels on my forehead, gave me herbal teas, prayed at the foot of my bed. She slept upright in the chair beside me, her feet wrapped in a shawl. When I awoke, she was still holding my hand. I felt a tightness in my chest, of affection, of gratitude. That day, had someone told me Conceição wasn't my blood daughter, I would have doubted them. It was as though she'd come from my own flesh, so tied was she to my heart. There wasn't one moment when that trust was born. It was built slowly, like embroidery, stitch by stitch. One moment, it was the floor cleaned without me asking. Another, the cake baked on my birthday, when I myself had forgotten the date. A silent affection, but firm. To me, Conceição was more than help. She was presence. She was company. She was refuge. And it was for that very reason that the fall hurt so deeply. But that was still in the future. In those days, she was my quiet blessing, my domestic angel. And I, blind with trust, didn't see that behind that apron was a woman of flesh, of longing, and of secrets. It is strange how the soul senses what the eyes refuse to see. Something stirs, deep inside, like a draft slipping beneath the door, and you feel it, but you do not want to feel it. That's how it was with me. There was no scandal, no scene, no stolen kiss for all to see. No, the first signs were like threads of mist, small, nearly invisible, but they were there, and I, foolishly, chose not to see. I remember well one afternoon when Conceição came into the sitting room with one of Antonio's shirts in her arms. It was ironed, folded, smelling of the soap he liked. She smiled and said, "He prefers the lighter one, doesn't he, Dona Maria?" I, without thinking, answered, "Yes, it's his favorite." But something inside me turned cold. She spoke with too much familiarity, like someone who notices, like someone who knows. Then there was that Friday night when Antonio came home later than usual, said the truck had broken down on the road. I was already ready for bed, the boys quiet in their room. And she, Conceição, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a small plate of food in her hand, asking, "Shall I take this up to him in the room?" Never before had she done that. I said no, that he could come to the kitchen, but the way she held that plate, as if she already knew his hunger, unsettled me. A kind of care that wasn't just from a servant, it was from someone who wants to please, who knows his taste, his habits, his ways. I began noticing little things, details that might have gone unnoticed in a busier household. But there, in our simple home, every detail had weight. The towel he used after his bath was always changed before I asked. His coffee, strong, no sugar, was ready every morning at the exact time, even when I slept late. The button on his favorite shirt, the one always coming loose, was sewn back without a word from me. And most of all, the looks. Ah, the looks. Never brazen, never bold. But there was a silence between them that slipped past me. When she entered the room and he was seated, he'd adjust himself. When she laughed at one of the children's stories, he'd watch her longer than needed. Once, I caught them in the kitchen. I'd just come in from the garden, basket of greens in hand, and paused in the doorway. He sat in the straw chair. She stood, stirring a pot. They were speaking softly, laughing. When they saw me, the silence dropped between them like an invisible glass crashing to the floor. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing, just laughing about a story on the radio," he said quickly. But I knew it was a lie. I just didn't know what kind yet. Another time, I heard footsteps down the corridor outside the bedroom. I thought it one of the boys. When I opened the door gently, I saw Conceição leaning in the doorway to the couple's room, alone, silent, looking at the bed. When she noticed me, she jumped, said she was looking for the broom, and again, I accepted it. I accepted everything, because I didn't want to doubt, because I trusted her, because I trusted him, and because the pain of suspicion is already almost a betrayal. Sometimes we choose silence out of fear of the answer, and I chose it. I chose not to ask questions. I chose not to follow steps. I chose to keep serving supper as if nothing were out of place, but something was. And the heart, that stubborn thing, was already screaming. It was on a stifling afternoon, one of those days when the sky feels heavy upon the rooftops, that my eyes met the envelope. I was tidying the bedroom, as I did every Wednesday, changing the sheets and beating the pillows against the windowsill, when I saw it, atop Antonio's dresser, a paper neatly folded and tied with a little blue cord. At first, I thought it might be a bill or a note from the children, but the care with which it was folded and the delicacy of the ribbon caught my attention. It wasn't a man's touch, I thought. Antonio was never one for frills. When he wrote, which was rare, it was with a clumsy hand and torn paper. This was different, feminine, hidden. I walked over slowly, took the paper between my fingers and turned it in my hand. There was no name. None. Not his, not mine, not anyone's. Just the closed envelope and a faint scent of lavender, the same we used on the linens. My heart beat strangely. A thump in my chest that wasn't fear, it was warning. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope in my lap. I stayed there for many minutes, staring at it like one stares at the locked door of a secret. All it would take was to pull the ribbon, and I would know. Just open it. But I did not, and to this day I cannot say why. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of cowardice, or maybe it was that stubborn faith that lives in some women, the belief that if we do not see, then it does not hurt. If we do not read, then it is not real. I put the envelope back, exactly as it was, cord by cord, fold by fold. That night, Antonio noticed nothing, or pretended not to. He sat at the table, ate in silence, just as he always did on Wednesdays, and I, with my hands folded in my lap, watched his mouth chew and thought, what could it have said? But I never asked. The next day, the letter was gone. I never saw it again, and I never looked for it again. But it still haunts me, because sometimes, my child, what we do not read marks us more than what we do. Life has a way of bending us right when we most need to stand tall, and so it was with me. It was during a slow, dragging winter, damp nights and bitter chills, that my body gave out. First it was my back, then my legs, and in the blink of an eye, I, who had always cared for everything and everyone, found myself unable even to rise from bed without help. The doctor came twice and said it was age, prescribed rest, warm compresses, and patience. Antonio, as usual, accepted it in silence, never one for tenderness nor sweet words. But he brought me tea, ate quietly, and left early for work, and that was when Conceição took over everything. She turned me gently when my back ached, washed my face with a damp cloth, combed my hair like I was a girl again, gave me medicine at the proper hour, cared for the house, the children, the meals, all of it, alone, without complaint, without haste, with a devotion that moved me. I remember the first night she slept in my room. I had trouble breathing and called for her. She came running, pulled a chair close, and sat at my side, staying there until morning. In the dark, I heard her pray in a whisper, a Lord's Prayer filled with faith and sorrow, as if she were asking for strength for two, for me and for herself. In those weeks, I began to see her differently. Before, she was help. Now, she was sustenance. I depended on her more than anyone else, more even than my own husband. And that, I confess, hurt me. It hurt because it made me feel small, because it showed me I was no longer mistress of the house, nor of the routine, nor even of myself. I was helpless, and the hand that held me up was hers. She bathed me with tenderness. Warm water ran down my shoulders as she, solemn-faced, lathered my arms with care. There was no malice, no haste. It was almost sacred. Afterward, she dressed me in light clothing, combed my hair, and draped my favorite shawl over my legs. "You look lovely like this, Dona Maria," she'd say, and I, so weak, would smile like a child. During those days, I watched my children play around the house and felt a lump in my throat. If something were to happen to me, who would care for them? and inside me, one part thought, she would, and another quieter part whispered, she already cares too much. Antonio spent little time at home, said he had to work double to cover expenses. When he came to see me, it was brief, tense, with the scent of the street on him. He asked no questions, did not kiss my forehead, only asked if I had taken my medicine, and left. And there I was, lying down, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps, hers. If she took too long to return from the market, I worried. If she coughed, I grew anxious. If she cried, a rare thing, but it happened, I wanted to comfort her. The illness tied me to the bed, and the bed tied me to her. It was in that time that dependence became something more, or what I believed to be more. Now I know it was a mix of gratitude, weakness, and loneliness. But in those days, I swear to you, I believed she was my salvation. Little did I know, she was also the hand that turned the knife. Silence, my child, is a kind of sickness when it settles in a marriage. It doesn't shout, it doesn't break anything, it doesn't slam doors. It simply settles, like mold on a forgotten wall. And when you realize it, it's everywhere. That's how it was with Antonio. During those months when illness had me bound to bed, he began to grow quieter. At first I thought it was worry. We were never ones for long conversations, but we had our rhythm, our shared looks, a whispered, "You'll get better," before sleep. And that vanished. He started coming home late, said work was demanding. He wouldn't dine with me, went straight to the bedroom or sat outside in the rocking chair, staring into the dark. When he passed by my bedside, he gave a nod. Sometimes not even that. And Conceição, she became the bridge, took the message, brought the reply. She'd say, "He asked that you drink your tea before sleep." Or, "The master said he'll be home late today." I accepted it. No strength to argue, no courage to question. Until one day, already feeling a little better, I asked him to sit beside me. "Antonio, you've changed," I said. He scratched his beard, looked away and muttered, "I'm tired, Maria. That's all." But it wasn't just that. It was distance. It was silence. It was the absence of all that had once been ours, even if small. He no longer touched me, no longer took my hand, no longer looked into my eyes. And I, day by day, began to feel like an old piece of furniture, present in the house, but forgotten. One night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was him going to the lavatory, but my bedroom door never opened. I waited. Nothing. Then the soft sound of a door closing at the end of the corridor, Conceição's room. I didn't go there. I didn't ask, but I cried. I cried because I already knew. I didn't need to see. A woman's heart knows before the eyes do, and mine had been screaming for some time. Antonio wasn't a cruel man, but he was a coward, and the worst kind of cowardice in a man is not having the courage to look into the eyes of the woman who loves him while he breaks her heart. There are moments in a woman's life when the heart breaks, not because of something she's told, but because of something she sees and chooses to ignore. That was the day I learned silence is also a decision, a defense, a pain dressed as protection. It was late afternoon. The sun still dragged over the rooftops, tinting everything in a calm golden hue. I had managed to rise on my own, leaning on my cane. I was better, still weak, but walking. And that day, I decided to go out to the porch to watch the boys playing in the yard. Before I reached the front door, I passed through the hallway. That's when I heard whispers coming from the kitchen. Nothing that sounded like an argument. Soft voices, intimate, so intimate that the sound froze me in place. I stopped quietly. My heart thudded. Then I looked. Through the slight opening of the half-closed door, there they were, Conceição and Antonio. She stood with her back to the sink, dish towel in her hands. He was in front of her, leaning on the counter, his head lowered. They weren't touching, not yet, but her eyes said everything. And the way he looked at her, it was not the look of a master, it was the look of a man, a look I knew, a look that had once been mine, a look that had once made me blush. I heard no words, I only saw. Their breathing was quiet, but there was tension, an invisible thread connecting them. And for a moment, I saw his hand move, as if to touch her. She didn't step back. Then he touched her, lightly, at the waist, just for a second, but long enough for my world to fall apart. I stepped back, silently, gripped my cane, took a deep breath, and kept walking to the front door as if nothing had happened. I sat on the porch chair and looked at the sky. I pretended my heart wasn't racing out of rhythm. I pretended my eyes hadn't seen, that my soul hadn't felt. That night, I served supper as usual, set his plate on the table, offered coffee, asked how his day had gone. He answered without meeting my eyes, and she didn't look at me at all. She stood at the sink, washing dishes as if the water might cleanse what stained her from within. I knew, but I said nothing, because, my child, there are wounds we bury deep, not from weakness, but from instinct, because sometimes the truth hurts more than the silence. The beginning of absence never arrives with noise. It settles in like someone who asks for silence and then simply never leaves. That was how it happened with Antonio. The man who once came home early, who embraced me with the scent of sawdust and sweat, began arriving late, and then he simply stopped arriving. The first time he slept away was on a Tuesday. He said the truck had broken down far from town and that he'd stay overnight at a station. The excuse sounded reasonable. After all, the roads were rough, and he was always a working man. I believed him, or rather, I preferred to believe. That night, I stayed awake longer than I should have, candle burning halfway down. With every sound at the gate, my heart jumped, but he never came. And silence, that old companion, lay beside me on the left side of the bed. The next day, he arrived early, smelled faintly of cheap hotel soap and had red eyes. He said little, claimed he was tired. I made coffee, toasted bread, and asked nothing. I pretended that coffee was like all the others, but my stomach knew it wasn't. After that came other nights, other absences, and the excuses changed. Long freight, flat tire, heavy rain, traffic jam, always a new reason. And I, more and more, stopped wanting to ask, because the answer, my child, the answer we already know, even when we don't want to hear it. Conceição on those days grew quieter, met my gaze less often. But she cared for me just the same, sometimes even more. She made me tea, massaged my feet, folded my shawl at the foot of the bed. And that hurt, because it was she who eased the pain of the wound she herself was causing. One night, I awoke to a sound. Rain was falling gently, and I heard footsteps on the porch. I rose slowly, cane in hand. When I reached the window, I saw Antonio entering through the gate, soaked, shirt clinging to him. There was no hurry in his walk, no guilt. He entered like one stepping into his own shadow, and I returned to bed like one returning to a warm grave. The next morning, he was still sleeping when Conceição brought me my coffee, on a tray, with a look that said she knew I knew. But she said nothing, only set down the tea, straightened my pillow, and left in silence. That's how the end arrives, my child. Slowly, without announcement, without shouting. It comes in the creak of the door, the ticking of the clock, the spoon that no longer stirs the cup, and before you know it, you're already alone. There comes a moment in certain sorrows when silence stops being a refuge and becomes a mirror. And it was in that mirror that I began to see myself, in her eyes. For there was once a time when I didn't know. Then came the time when I did. And then came the time when I realized she knew I knew. No words passed between us. None. No question. No answer. But the way she began to look at me changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was something more complex. A sad respect, like one who lowers her eyes before a fallen queen. She began moving more softly through the house, avoided rooms where I was present. When she spoke, it was in gentler tones, like one caring for someone past saving. And I began to watch. Every gesture of hers was measured. When she brought coffee, she placed it on the table with steady hands, but never met my gaze. When she handed me clean laundry, it was folded to perfection, yet her eyes stayed on the cloth. It was as if she said, I know, and so do you, but let us carry on. And we did. At lunch, she no longer sat with us, claimed she had tasks, said she would eat later, and I let her, because there was no more room for sharing, no more communion, only cohabitation. And that is the saddest of presences, the one that exists because it must, not because it wants to. I remember an afternoon when the radio played an old song, one of those about longing. She was wiping the living room floor, and I, from my chair, watched silently. The lyrics spoke of hidden love, and I saw, just for a moment, a tear fall from her eye, quiet, without commotion. Then I knew, she knew that I knew, and she cried for that, not out of regret, but consequence, for having been discovered, for crossing a line that once crossed cannot be returned from. After that day, everything between us became shadow. She still cared for me, the house, the children, but not with the same lightness. There was weight in the air, as if the dust of truth hovered over us, waiting for someone to sneeze, and no one did. We simply sat there, breathing it in, and pretending it was air. Silence had lived among us for months, but that night, it weighed differently. It was a deeper kind of emptiness, colder, as though the house itself held its breath, and no one knew why. Conceição had left in the late afternoon, as she did every week, to fetch a piece of fabric she'd ordered from the shop. She went with a shawl over her shoulders, steps steady, eyes downcast, said nothing more than, "I'll be back soon, Dona Maria." And I, even knowing all I knew, believed her. The night crept in slowly. The boys slept, the kettle hissed, and Antonio had yet to return. The house was all creaking wood, wind in the cracks, and my heart beating out of rhythm. An hour passed, then 2, 3, and still she didn't come. I looked through the parlor window so many times the glass fogged from my breath. Every shadow that passed in the street made me hold my breath. But it wasn't her. It never was. When the wall clock struck midnight, the gate opened. It wasn't Conceição. It was Antonio. He entered as if he owed nothing to anyone, with that same calm of his. Knocked the dust from his boots, hung up his hat, walked past me like I was part of the wall, and went to the bedroom, said nothing of her, didn't feign concern, didn't ask why the table was set for 3, with only 2 present. It was then I truly knew there was something more than betrayal between them. There was understanding, there was complicity, and worse, there was a secret no longer hidden, merely disguised as routine. I went to her room. It was tidy, bed made, linens folded neatly, but the pillow still smelled of her, still warm. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I don't know for what. Maybe remorse, maybe a miracle, maybe courage, but she didn't come back. The next morning, she was still gone. Antonio left early without a word, and I sat there, a cup of cold coffee in my hands, staring at the gate, at the floor, at the past. It wasn't until the end of the next day that she returned. She entered through the kitchen door, eyes red, clothes too clean, carried a bag with the fabric, didn't say where she'd been, didn't apologize, only said, "Took longer than I expected," and returned to her tasks, as if the absence had been a mere slip in time, as if the heart of the house hadn't shattered in her absence. I watched her, and I didn't say a single word, because in that moment I understood there was nothing left to say. The house no longer breathed as it once had. It was as though the walls had grown tired of hearing us pretend. I moved more slowly, not from age or illness, but from the weight of all the words left unsaid, the weariness of gestures that only echoed what we no longer wished to feel. It was on a warm morning, one of those where time seems to hang still, that Conceição appeared in the parlor, with her gaze lowered and her hands folded in front of her apron. I was seated in the wicker chair, mending one of the boys' shirts. The sound of the radio barely covered the silence. "Dona Maria," she said, barely above a whisper, "I wanted to speak with you for a moment, if you'd allow it." I nodded without lifting my eyes. I kept stitching the cloth, as if I might sew together a piece of my own calm along with it. "I'm thinking of leaving." Those words, though soft, cut like a knife, not from surprise, for deep down I had expected it. But even still, it hurt. She continued, "I don't think I'm doing good here anymore. You're better now. The boys are growing. And well, there are things one feels when it's time to go." I stopped stitching. I looked at her, and for the first time in many months, our eyes met without flinching. There was weariness in her face, and a silent plea that I not stop her, or perhaps a hidden hope that I would. I still don't know. It took me a moment to answer. The knot in my throat was large, not from anger, but from mourning. "Where will you go?" I asked, almost in a whisper. "To my aunt's house, in the countryside. She has a little room, and she's in need of help. It'll be quieter. More right. More right." That phrase echoed inside me, as though all that had happened here, even wrong, had been so intimate, so intense, that now it needed a right place to be forgotten. "When do you plan to leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." I nodded again. She turned slowly, like one stepping from a dark room into the sun. And before disappearing down the hallway, she said, "Thank you for everything, Dona Maria." Truly. I wanted to answer, but I couldn't. That night I didn't sleep. I heard her throughout the house, folding clothes, shifting drawers, crying softly. All the while, I knew it was the end, but I couldn't tell if it was relief or sorrow. When morning came, I rose before she left. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread. She had tidied everything. Clothes folded, dishes clean, the house in order. She saw me, her suitcase already in hand. "I'll be going now," she said. I gave one final nod, and she was gone, without looking back. And I was left with the feeling that it wasn't just the end of a presence, it was the end of a piece of me. The silence after she left was not the same silence as before. Before, it was a heavy silence, full of unsaid words, of averted eyes, of things we knew but pretended not to know. After she was gone, the silence was different. It was emptiness. The house, so used to her footsteps, her whispers, her small sounds of care, became hollow. The creak of the porch chair sounded louder. The clink of the spoon on the plate was dry, sorrowful. The boys asked about her in the first few days. I told them she had gone to help a relative. They accepted it with that ease only children possess. But I did not accept it. I rose early the morning after she left, walked through the rooms like one looking for an echo. Everything was in its place, too much in place. Cushions aligned, jars sealed, laundry on the line still smelling faintly of lavender. She had left the house ready to endure absence, but nothing prepares the heart. Antonio began arriving home earlier, sat at the table as though nothing had happened, read the paper, ate in silence, sometimes asked about the children, and I replied with a nod, a murmur. We never spoke of her again. It was as if she had evaporated from our history, but she was in everything, in the way the cloths were folded, in the scent of the tea, in the cupboard corner where she kept her sewing thread, in the empty space behind the kitchen door, the spot where she'd leaned to rest for a moment. Silence became a presence. It sat in every corner. At night, I sometimes woke certain I had heard her footsteps. I would go to the hallway with my cane in hand, stop, wait, but nothing. It was only emptiness, visiting me with a familiar face. One of those nights, I sat at the edge of the bed, alone. Moonlight streamed through the window, drawing shadows on the floor. I took the shawl she used to fold with such care and held it close. I cried without sound, the way she did. It wasn't just longing. It was guilt. It was loss. It was the memory of what had been, and of what should never have been. When someone leaves, my child, they don't take just their body. They take what was said, what was left unsaid, what was dreamed. And what remains is a silence that speaks louder than 1,000 words. Days had passed since she left. The house moved as a body without a soul, alive on the outside, hollow within. I did what needed doing, tended the children, prepared meals, washed the linens. But my spirit, it felt folded like a bedsheet buried deep in a chest. It was on one of those days, while arranging the wardrobe that had once been hers, that I found the letter. It wasn't hidden. It lay there, neatly folded, tucked between the bed linens. The envelope was plain. No name, no address, just a crisp fold and the faint scent of her, lavender and coconut soap. I sat on the edge of the bed, letter trembling in my fingers. I breathed deep, looked toward the sky through the window as one asks God for permission before learning the truth. Then I opened it. The handwriting was hers, small, round, careful. She began by saying she wasn't sure I'd ever read it, that perhaps it would remain forgotten there among the linens, like everything else she herself had tried to forget. She said she wasn't writing to justify anything, but because she needed to leave behind something, even if just a thread, of what she carried inside. She spoke of me, said she had admired me from the beginning, that she cared for me not out of duty, but from a deep affection, almost inexplicable. That many times she had wanted to say things, but silence had felt more respectful. She spoke of Antonio, said it was never planned, that it happened little by little, that he had looked at her differently one ordinary day, and that look planted doubt in her heart. And later, a choice, said she tried to resist, that she felt guilt, that she cried alone many times. But she also said that for a time she believed what she felt was love. Finally, she spoke of the day she decided to leave, that it was because of me, that she could no longer serve me with hands stained by silence, that every time she folded my shawl, a part of her broke. The letter ended with a request, forgiveness, and just beneath it, a short line. If I had been someone else, perhaps we might have been friends. I closed the letter with trembling hands. I did not cry. Not then. I placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, between my rosaries and old photographs, and for days I read it again and again. Like one rereads a wound to learn how to live with it, she was gone. But the letter remained, and in that paper, she told me more than in all our years of silence. Some conversations are born never to happen. They form in silence, grow in glances, ache in the chest, but never find a voice. Mine with her was just that, an entire conversation made of absences. During the time she lived with us, there were so many moments when a single word would have been enough, one gesture. A simple, I know, or forgive me. But those words remained suspended between us, like laundry left on the line during rain, visible, yet untouchable. After she left, and even more so after the letter, that imagined conversation began to visit me often. I saw her seated on the porch chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes to the ground, and I before her, heart in my throat, but steady. I would begin by saying I knew, that I had always known, that her silence was a confession, that my silence too had been a choice, not of weakness, but of survival. I would tell her I didn't understand everything, but I understood loneliness, that sometimes the heart chooses wrong just to feel alive. She would listen in silence, her eyes welling. I'd continue, speak of pain, of jealousy, of betrayal, but also of the tenderness that still lingered between us, despite everything, of how she cared for me, even as she hurt me, of a presence that was both wound and balm. Then she'd say she never meant to hurt me, that what happened with him wasn't hatred toward me, but a lack of love for herself, and I would answer that I already knew, and that it hurt just the same. And in the end, perhaps she would take my hand, and the two of us would cry at last, not for betrayal, not for guilt, but for the loss of something that, deep down, could have been beautiful. A friendship, a bond, a love between women made of care and respect. But that conversation never happened. It lived only here, within. In the imagined memory the soul creates to soothe what life never gave. And to this day, from time to time, I still hear it. Her sitting beside me, saying without words, I wish I'd said it too. Today, when I look into the old mirror in my bedroom, I don't just see time etched on my skin or white in my hair. I see layers of a woman who lived things she never imagined. A woman who was a wife, a mother, betrayed, cared for, silent, and at last, a survivor. What remained in me after everything wasn't bitterness. It was memory, a clean scar, the kind one can touch without pain. But that still teaches. It was the unanswered questions, the gestures that won't return, the silences that screamed louder than any quarrel. After she left, and the truth became a gentle shadow in the house, I learned to live with solitude in a new way, not as absence, but as company. Silence became my confidant, and time, my remedy. Antonio kept on living as though nothing had ever happened. He died years later, quietly, in the same chair where he had so often avoided looking at me. When I buried him, I didn't cry for him. I cried for me, for the woman I had been beside him, for the one I had endured becoming, for the one I had to invent just to keep from disappearing. I kept few things of his. The pocket watch, the blue flannel shirt he wore when he proposed to me, and a yellowed photograph of us on our engagement day. The rest, I let go, not out of anger, but for freedom. From her, I kept the letter, and deep in my heart, a nameless kind of longing, a soft sort of ache, one that does not accuse, does not scream. It simply stays. With time, I understood that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It is accepting that stories don't always follow the script we dreamed, and still, they deserve to be told. Now, seated in this chair where I spend my afternoons, I watch my grandchildren run in the yard and think, they'll never know everything. But maybe one day, if they open a diary, a letter, or this notebook I now write in, maybe they'll understand that love, pain, betrayal, silence, all of it is part of being human, and that even when it feels like everything is breaking, there still remains in us a breath of beginning. Because in the end, what remained in me was courage. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.